When many of his disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" Have you ever felt like you were asked to do the impossible? Life can be really overwhelming sometimes. My hope for this summer is that it was going to be a time of rest, of relaxation, and of restoration. And in some ways that's happened, but the Delta variant of the coronavirus has had other ideas. Now, all of a sudden, we have to be careful again. And for many folks, it's enough just to keep their own family safe and to worry about just how to protect the ones that they love the most. But that's not all that's going on in the world. If we look around Summit County, many of our siblings are really struggling to find housing that they can afford. Folks in Afghanistan are trying desperately to get out of the country if they fear that their lives are in danger, and many people do. And people in Haiti are still reeling after another earthquake. And it's just all of this news, and including the earthquake or the hurricane that is headed for New York. There's a lot going on. And as we attempt to process these things, we remember, as we were reminded in our first reading today and in the Psalm, we are still a pilgrim people. We are meeting on Zoom. And when we're not on Zoom, we're still not in St. John the Baptist Church. We are pilgrims waiting to be able to go back to our temple, our spiritual home. This is difficult. Who can accept it? I wonder if this is how the disciples felt when they heard Jesus giving the message that we heard today. Now, a bit of background before this passage. So at the beginning of this chapter, Jesus had fed the 5,000, which we know probably because of women and children, it was more than 5,000, an impressive feat at any rate. And the disciples, the crowd of disciples around him, wanted to know what was going on. Is this a sign? Will there be a sign? Are you a prophet? Give us some context. They bring up Moses in the desert, who gave manna to the people of Israel during the Exodus. And Jesus starts to go along with this. And he says, yes, in fact, it's not just Moses. This bread of heaven was a gift from God. And then I can imagine the disciples kind of nodding and being like, all right, we get this guy. But then Jesus overaccepts. He says, not only is bread from heaven a gift from God, but I am that bread of heaven. And that really throws the disciples off. Jesus says, if you eat my body and drink my blood, then you will have life within you. Then I will abide within you. Jesus says, God abides in me. And if you eat my body and drink my blood, I abide in you. Now, on a basic level, if someone says, if you eat my body and drink my blood, it's bound to be at least a little bit shocking. But I want to dig a little bit deeper beyond that surface level to think about maybe what might have been going on in the disciples' heads. I wonder if the disciples were so afraid because of the thought of Jesus, of God abiding within them. If Jesus were abiding within my life, how would my life be different? And in fact, I know that Jesus is abiding within me. How am I called to live my life differently? This is a thought that's both exciting for me and absolutely terrifying, as I imagine it must have been for the disciples. This summer, I completed clinical pastoral education at Dell Seton or Del Seton and Del Children's Hospitals in Austin, Texas. And this was a transformative experience for me. I learned so much, and it didn't always feel like Jesus was within me. Especially at the beginning, during patient interactions, I would just babble and talk on and on and on. And I know this must be surprising for all of you, especially Mom and Dad and Josh. But I found that I was talking so much that I couldn't make room for the other person to talk, much less room for God to show up from within me and from within the other person. There were other times that the opposite happened. I would just be standing there like a bump on a log, and I wouldn't have anything to say. I wouldn't have any peaceful presence about me. I was just thinking about how I was going to get out of that room as fast as I could. And those were frustrating visits for me and probably for the patient and the patient's family as well. But there were other times too, times that I knew that Jesus was dwelling within me. I'm thinking in particular about a teenage patient who had a congenital condition that was getting worse pretty quickly. And this patient's mother asked me to go to a care conference with her. Now, the care conference was a meeting between all of the doctors on this patient's care team and the patient's family. So in this case, the patient's mother. And during the course of this care conference, they determined, the patient's mother and the doctors determined that the most loving, the most compassionate thing for this patient was for him to go home on hospice. And as this was going on, I didn't know what to do. I felt really helpless until I felt the hand of the patient's mother reach out for mine. And I held her hand. After the care conference, I was frustrated because no words were coming to mind, nothing helpful or holy or gracious. But then I remembered I had been present with this mother. There was nothing that I could have said that would have made having to go home with her child on hospice any better, any easier. But being there and holding her hand was what I needed to be. In that moment, I know I was able to connect to Jesus, to God abiding within me. I knew that Jesus was living within me because I was living out what Jesus would have done in that situation. But how did this happen for me? If I knew exactly what I did to help Jesus appear within me that day,
Sasha preaching today.
If I knew if I knew what to do, I would do it every time, and I would never have an awkward patient visit again, which for the chaplains among you, I'm sure you know that that is not a real possibility. But there are moments when I'm able to connect to Jesus within me. And I think Simon Peter's words in today's gospel near the end are really helpful for me. Now, Simon Peter is not as much of a bumbler in John's gospel as he is in the other synoptic gospels. And when Jesus says to his 12 apostles, his chosen disciples, "Are you going to leave me too?" Simon Peter says, "Lord, to whom can we go? You have the words of eternal life." Peter says, I recognize that this is nothing I can handle on my own, or nothing I can handle without you, but I need you. In my own life, so often I try to do things by myself. I try to be in charge and to run everything as best as I can. But in those moments when I remember that I'm not actually in charge, that God is the one who's in charge, that Jesus within me is the one who's trying to get me to live life a little more, with a little bit more love. Those are the moments that I'm able to connect to other people and even to myself. So I wonder, when is a time in your life when Jesus has been abiding within you? Where were you? What was the situation? How did you feel? How did other people react to you? What was it like to live out of the knowledge that Jesus was dwelling within you, even if you didn't realize that's what you were doing at the time? And I wonder if there's somewhere in your life today, somewhere in your life this week, where you could ask Jesus to just guide you a little bit more, where you could give up that control. What might that look like? Would you be a little kinder to yourself, to others? What might you be open to? The possibilities are limitless. And the most beautiful thing is the answer is different for every one of us. My prayer for you this week is that you are able to experience Jesus abiding within you. Amen.